Hey there, my name is Simon Owens. This is my daily blog. Today I wanted to talk about Buzzfeed. There's a lot of chatter that's going on that it's going to be IPOing at some point soon. And I wanted to kind of talk about why I think it is a truly innovative company that isn't overhyped. Now, I think there are a lot of other companies that have received cast infusions within the last few years that are a little bit overhyped. One of them is Vice Media. A few days ago, it was announced that it had received some gargantuan amount of money, something like $500 million on a with a $5 billion valuation, and I really just think that's a bubble that's going to pop the second that Vice Media IPOs. To kind of understand why, think about like the last time that Vice Media had a piece of content that everybody was talking about on social media, where you opened up Facebook or Twitter and everybody was linking or chattering about it. The New York Times, Washington Post, BuzzFeed, some other top publications, they produce talked about content all the time, and Vice Media just doesn't. I think that they're just really good at selling a story to investors, convincing them that they're on the cutting edge with millennials and that they're the future. And I think once they're subjected to the IPO and what it is to be a public company and actually have to report out revenue and where it's coming from, I think that's going to be deflated pretty quickly. Vox Media is another one of those companies that has been receiving a lot of funding and a lot of hype. I think it's a very strong company. Vox.com has just been killing it on video. Just a really amazing narrative storytelling, little mini documentaries. I find myself watching it on Facebook all the time. Recode's a daily read for me. Listen to their podcast. So I think Vox is really well diversified and has some really smart people, and they're really thinking about how media can be done differently with their explainers and really not treating readers and viewers like they're dumb. But BuzzFeed, let's talk about that. And so one thing that you hear from a lot of people is they like to dismiss BuzzFeed as this kind of clickbait factory, and they like to lump it in with sites like Upworthy and some of these other kind of viral listicle sites and stuff like that. But it's actually the opposite of a clickbait factory, and I think that's why it's particularly innovative and why it's in a strong position. From the very beginning of its infancy, unlike just about any other media company, it's completely eschewed display advertising and has refused to accept it from the very beginning and has focused 100% on native advertising. Now, a lot of other media companies are now on the native advertising bandwagon and they're growing those parts of their business, but they're still heavily reliant on display advertising. And display advertising creates all kinds of terrible incentives within media because it rewards page views over substance, and so that's why you see lots of back in the day pagination, slideshows, cheap gimmicks to get people to click on things. A lot of like curation and aggregation without actually adding any value to the reporting. All the things that make the internet terrible, I think can be laid at the feet at display advertising. And BuzzFeed has never had to do that. They don't sell page views. So in the same way that just about every other media company has, and I think that's really brilliant and it has allowed it not to kind of get itself boxed in the way of these other, and it also makes it less reliant on platforms like Facebook because it doesn't need to drive traffic to BuzzFeed.com. And speaking of Facebook, another thing that's amazing about BuzzFeed is that it's completely platform agnostic in a way that no other company or most other companies can't be. Because it's doing native advertising, a lot of its advertisers and brands that it works with, they don't care if the content is consumed on BuzzFeed.com. Like they're just as happy if the branded content is seen on Facebook or Snapchat or whatever. And this has allowed BuzzFeed to really innovate and not just try to drive traffic to BuzzFeed.com, but really kind of create native content on all these platforms that is really innovative to it. A really good example in terms of its innovation is all these kind of spin-off brands it's doing, like the most famous of which is Tasty. It's kind of food and cooking show that has largely done really well on Facebook. And so every time a new platform emerges, whether it's Periscope, Facebook Messenger, Lively, all these kind of some of these apps that you've probably barely even heard of, BuzzFeed really thinks about how do we really innovate on this platform? How do we create something that caters to the demographics on the platform, but also isn't just cheap gimmicks to get them to click away to the platform to BuzzFeed.com. And so that allows it to continue to experiment in a way that you want any company to do, whereas a more traditional company is forced to kind of adhere to its original business model, which is display advertising. One thing that you really have to admire them is investing in prestige journalism, under BuzzFeed News and Ben Smith. A lot of people have pointed out that this is probably the least profitable part of BuzzFeed, but I think looking at just pure profit, that's kind of like a red herring. And I'm sure BuzzFeed realizes this, that investing in prestige journalism, while it doesn't generate the most traffic or the most revenue, and advertisers probably aren't as eager to appear on that, it definitely helps in terms of building the brand of BuzzFeed. Really kind of they're actually able to break major news and unlike Vice, have pieces that are constantly under discussion. They are constantly part of the narrative, constantly part of the chatter that's going on Twitter and Facebook. People are paying attention. BuzzFeed was the outlet that broke the Trump or the dossier from on the supposed P tape and all the other revelations, and they're just really strong, really good reporting, and also they do kind of magazine level reporting that goes really deep, and that's something that I really appreciate as a journalist, and I think even though it's probably not profitable, really strengthens the company, because I think the fluffier content, sometimes people will watch it, but it doesn't really endear them to a company, whereas something that's more in-depth, emotional, or really caters to people's interest creates that kind of like long-term brand value. That's not to say that there aren't weaknesses. One thing that I think with the native advertising model, and especially when in regard to the IPO, is it just doesn't scale very well. And we've seen this in recent years where BuzzFeed has missed, at least reportedly, its internal revenue goals. And the reason it doesn't scale very well is because they're insisting on creating each piece of content themselves, and it's really hard to have that level of quality control and then expand it to more and more brands. So it creates kind of like a bottleneck. So they can either continue hiring more people to work on the brand side, which obviously is really hard to do to maintain that quality control, or they can charge more money, but that creates its own limitations, which I'm about to talk about. Also, there's that you don't want the oversaturation in ads. So if for instance, Tasty creates a lot of branded content, and they need to maintain a ratio of non-branded content to branded content. So it's hard to scale, from 5 pieces of branded content a week to 10 pieces of branded content a week before users start getting tired of it. Unless of course their branded content is just so good that the users just don't care that it's branded content, so it doesn't make a difference to them, in which case they don't care if it's an ad or not. The other weakness is that there's a barrier to entry to being a BuzzFeed advertiser. Like the minimum that you have to spend is probably north of $100,000, and there's just only so many companies that can make that kind of ad buy. And the genius of companies like Facebook and Twitter, LinkedIn is that even if I only have if I'm a small business and I only have a budget of a few $100s a month, I can go on to Facebook right now and spend that money. And it is allowed, companies like Facebook and Google to really scale unlike any other media company, because basically there's no barrier to entry, and you can really capitalize on that long tail. And BuzzFeed just can't do that. They're just like a lot of other media companies out there where you can't do self-service ads, and that's especially true for these super expensive, at least with display advertising. A lower end publisher can do some programmatic ad buying, which would allow them to get on a news site, and they wouldn't have to have a massive budget to do it. But with BuzzFeed, they just can't do that. How is BuzzFeed addressing this issue? They're moving into the e-commerce space where they're getting affiliate marketing deals with Amazon and other kind of e-commerce companies, and doing kind of buyer recommendation lists that allow them to basically, create really good content that recommends things to buy, and they get, basically, if anybody clicks on that link and buys it, they get a cut of that. So that obviously they're not the only ones that think of this, and it allows them to make money on A, their readers, and B, kind of some of these companies that might not be able to afford the high price of admission to joining their native advertising program. So I think that BuzzFeed is really innovative. They create really great content. As a 33-year-old, I don't consume all their content. In fact, a lot of their more fluffy content just doesn't really appeal to me at all, but they're really good at diversifying and speaking to different audiences. So they certainly have plenty of good content that speaks to me, and especially from their news content side. So I think they're really well positioned, and I think so. The last valuation was they're valued at $1.7 billion, whereas Vice is at 5-point-something billion dollars. I think you should flip those two. BuzzFeed is definitely talked about, engaged with more than Vice, so I think that they're worth a lot more than that. So I'm really bullish on BuzzFeed. I'm not the kind of guy who buys stocks, but if they IPO'd, I would consider buying their stock. So that's all I have to say for today.